Can China's Navy actually overtake the US? In the span of just 4 years, Chinese shipyards launch a volume of warships equivalent to the entire French Navy. It is the largest shipbuilding spree since World War II. For decades, the United States Navy has held uncontested command of the global commons. It wasn't just the biggest, it was the only true blue water superpower. But recently, a new report suggests that China is laying the keel for not just one, but 2 new aircraft carriers simultaneously. This brings us to the ultimate question of the 21st century. Is the era of American naval supremacy ending? Can the Chinese Navy truly surpass the US Navy? And if so, how many years are left on the clock? If you look strictly at hull count, the number of ships in the water, China has already won. The Pentagon's latest China Military Power Report estimates the PLA Navy has approximately 370 battle force ships and submarines. The United States Navy sits at roughly 292. On paper, China has the largest navy in the world. But as any naval architect will tell you, counting hulls is a deceptive metric. A 1,500-ton Corvette and a 100,000-ton supercarrier both count as one ship on that list. When we switch the metric to tonnage, the total weight of displacement, which roughly correlates to firepower, fuel, and endurance, the picture flips dramatically. The US Navy displaces approximately 4.5 million tons. The Chinese Navy is catching up, but sits at roughly 2.5 million tons. The US fleet is still, pound for pound, nearly twice the size of China's. However, the trend lines are what matters. The US fleet is aging, retiring Ticonderoga-class cruisers faster than it canceling Constellation-class frigates. China, conversely, is retiring nothing. They are adding modern tonnage at a rate that is statistically unprecedented in peacetime. The central question revolves around the capital ships, aircraft carriers. Currently, China operates 3 carriers: Type 001 Liaoning, a refurbished Soviet hull; training-focused Type 002 Shandong, a domestic copy of the Soviet design; ski jump ramp, limited range, limited payload; Type 003 Fujian. This is the game changer. Launched in 2022, fully operational likely by 2026. It displaces 80,000 plus tons and, crucially, uses electromagnetic catapults. This allows it to launch heavy aircraft with full fuel and ammo and support aircraft like the KJ-600, which is China's answer to the E-2 Hawkeye. If China adds 2 more, likely Type 004, rumors suggest they might attempt nuclear propulsion. Nuclear power is the gold standard. It provides unlimited range and massive electricity generation for future directed energy weapons. So, if China gets to 5 or 6 carriers by 2035, have they caught up? The US Navy operates 11 supercarriers. But the math of naval operations is governed by the rule of 3. For every carrier you want deployed in a combat zone, you need 3 in existence. 1 is on deployment. 1 is training up for deployment. 1 is in dry dock for deep maintenance. With 11 carriers, the US can theoretically keep 3 to 4 strike groups deployed globally at all times, with the ability to surge 2 or 3 more in a crisis. With a 5-carrier fleet, China could permanently sustain perhaps 1 or 2 strike groups at sea. But China does not need to match the US 1-for-1 to challenge American power. The US Navy has global responsibilities, patrolling the Atlantic, the Med, the Persian Gulf. The PLA Navy is almost entirely concentrated in the Western Pacific. In a localized conflict, the numbers game becomes much closer. It effectively becomes 3 or 4 Chinese carriers versus the 3 or 4 US carriers that can get to the fight in time. The gap here isn't just hull numbers, it's sortie generation rate. We know the US Nimitz and Ford class can sustain high-intensity flight ops for weeks. We have never seen the PLA Navy do this. Learning to dance the ballet of the flight deck takes decades of institutional blood, sweat, and tears. China is learning fast, but they are still in the novice phase of carrier aviation. While carriers get the glamour shots, the real workhorses of modern naval warfare are the destroyers. This is where the gap has arguably already closed. Enter the Type 055 destroyer. Chinese called it a destroyer, but at 12,000 plus tons, it is a cruiser. It packs 112 vertical launch system cells. These cells are larger than American Mark 41 cells, capable of carrying the YJ-21 hypersonic anti-ship ballistic missile. The U.S. equivalent is the Arleigh Burke Flight 3, a phenomenal ship boasting the best radar in the world, but it is an older hull design maxed out on weight and power generation. And there is also a missile gap. The U.S. Navy is currently facing a range crisis. The standard U.S. anti-ship missile, the Harpoon, and even the newer Naval Strike Missile lack the range and speed of China's YJ-18 and YJ-21. The U.S. is rushing to field the standard Missile 6 and the Maritime Strike Tomahawk to compensate. But currently, Chinese surface ships can theoretically outstick American destroyers, firing from ranges where the U.S. cannot shoot back. China has launched 8 Type 055 in the time it took the U.S. to build just a handful of Flight 3. If we look at high-end vertical launch capacity, the number of missile tubes available in the Pacific, China is on a trajectory to surpass the U.S. 7th Fleet assets by 2027. So far, the picture looks grim for the U.S. But we haven't talked about the silent service. If there is one domain where the United States maintains a decisive generational advantage, it is under the waves. The U.S. operates roughly 50 nuclear attack submarines. China operates roughly 6 to 9 nuclear attack subs, relying mostly on a fleet of diesel-electric boats. U.S. submarines, Virginia and Seawolf class, are acoustically superior. They are quieter, have better sensors, and have better crews. China's submarines are getting quieter, but open-source intelligence suggests they still lag behind 1990s U.S. standards in noise dampening. Why this matters? In South China Sea scenario, the U.S. surface fleet might be held back by Chinese missiles. But U.S. submarines could penetrate the first island chain and wreak havoc on Chinese amphibious landing ships. China currently lacks effective anti-submarine warfare capabilities compared to NATO standards. They are building ASW helicopters and corvettes rapidly, but hunting a nuclear submarine in the deep ocean is the hardest task in naval warfare. However, quantity has a quality all its own. In the shallow waters of South China Sea, China's smaller diesel-electric subs don't need to be fast or have infinite range. They just need to sit on the bottom and wait. In littoral waters, the U.S. acoustic advantage is negated by the noisy ocean environment. We've counted ships and missiles, but navies march on their stomachs, or rather, their fuel tankers. The United States Navy is an expeditionary navy. It is designed to fight 5,000 miles from home. It has a massive fleet of oilers, supply ships, and a global network of bases in Japan, South Korea, Singapore, and now increasingly the Philippines. The Chinese Navy is a fortress fleet. It is designed to fight under the umbrella of its land-based air cover and missile batteries. As soon as the PLA Navy moves beyond the first island chain, the line from Japan to Taiwan to the Philippines, its combat power drops off a cliff. They lack the bases to reload VLSLs or repair battle damage in the deep Pacific. If a Type 055 runs out of missiles in the Central Pacific, it has to sail all the way back to China. If a U.S. destroyer runs out, it can pull into Guam or Yokosuka or resupply at sea. Furthermore, we must look at coalitions. If war breaks out, the U.S. Navy is interoperable with the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force, the Royal Australian Navy, and perhaps the UK and France. The PLA Navy largely fights alone. When you aggregate the U.S. and its Pacific allies, the tonnage and VLS count shift back overwhelmingly in favor of the coalition. So, to answer the question posed by the headlines, can China overtake the U.S. Navy? If we define overtake as building a global blue water navy capable of controlling the Atlantic and Pacific simultaneously, not in the next 20 years. The U.S. advantage in nuclear propulsion, global basing, and institutional experience is too vast. However, if we define overtake as achieving local superiority in the Western Pacific, that is a very different answer. Most reputable analysts, including SIZE and the Office of Naval Intelligence, point to the 2027 to 2030 window as the danger zone. By 2030, China's third and fourth carriers will likely be operational. Their Type 055 cruiser fleet will have matured. Their land-based hypersonic missiles will be fully integrated. In this specific region, right on China's doorstep, the curves cross. The PLA Navy will have more ships, more missiles, and shorter supply lines than the U.S. forces available in theater. The timeline looks like this: 2025 to 2027, the Davison window, the period where the U.S. fleet is shrinking due to retirements while China is peaking in production. This is the period of maximum risk for U.S. Navy. 2030 to 2035, the U.S. begins to rebound. New frigates and forward carriers enter service. The U.S. industrial base, hopefully, recovers. 2049, China's goal for a world-class military. By this point, they aim to challenge the U.S. globally, potentially with nuclear-powered carriers and global bases. So, the conclusion is, the Chinese Navy does not need to be better than the U.S. Navy everywhere. They just need to be better in one place for a few weeks. The report on China building 2 more aircraft carriers is a signal of their intent. They're moving away from a coastal defense force to a power projection force. The U.S. Navy is currently a better fighting force, man for man, hull for hull. But the U.S. is distracted, stretched thin across the globe, and struggling with a rusted industrial shipbuilding base. China is focused, concentrated, and building at warp speed. The gap is closing. And in the brutally cold calculus of naval warfare, second best is just a fancy term for the loser. What do you think? Is the U.S. Navy's technology enough to offset China's industrial mass? Let me know in the comments below.